Okay, we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight for this webinar. I'm Leslie Hughes from Mass Advocates for Children, also known as MAC, and I'm going to be presenting this webinar on special education law and autism spectrum disorder. But before we start, we have a few housekeeping items to talk about. We have a lot of material to cover, so I'm going to stop about halfway through for a few minutes for questions. And then again at the end. Shalene Gupta is here from MAC, and she'll be helping with the webinar, including relaying your questions to me as we go through the presentation. So this is Shalene, and she's going to explain how to ask questions.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Leslie. So on your menu screen, there should be a little box that says questions, and if you type, I will get that question and I can relay it to Leslie during the midway point and at the end of the presentation. In addition, if you have any comments you'd like to say, use the questions form and I'll get them throughout the webinar. In addition, you can download the presentation slides. There should be a handouts box. Just click on the plus sign and you can download the handouts. And finally, at the very end of our presentation, a survey will pop up on your screen. Please fill it out. We take this feedback very seriously, and it's very important to us, and we really value your opinion.
Great. Thank you, Shalene. So before we get started, I want to tell people a little bit about MAC. I'm sure probably a lot of you are familiar with MAC, but we like to make sure everybody knows who we are. We're a private, nonprofit child advocacy organization, and we've been around for over 45 years. Our mission has always been about being an effective voice for children facing significant life and educational barriers, barriers such as poverty, discrimination, and disability. At MAC, we use a multi-pronged approach, and the Autism Project, which is the project that I'm working on, uses a multi-pronged approach as well. We have a helpline where anybody in the state can give a call and get information or referrals. We also do trainings for parents like this one. We also do trainings for professionals. And we're a legal office, so we're a very small legal office, so we do some case representation. And we like to get information from all of those different areas and identify trends, and then we work with the legislature to develop and pass laws that can help children throughout the state with autism. If you want to learn more about us, please go to our website. Our address is www.massadvocates.org. And if you love our work and would like to donate to MAC, there's a place for that on our website as well. We want to keep providing the quality work that we do, such as these trainings, and we depend on private funders and donors to keep us going. So that's about MAC, and I've been at MAC for quite a while, but I'm also a parent. I have a 16-year-old son on the autism spectrum, and I do tend to use some personal examples as we go throughout, so you'll probably get to know my son a little bit as we go through. Some objectives. Some of the objectives, some of the things I'd like you to take away from this presentation. I'd like you to learn about the law, understand some of the key components of the law and how different points of the law can be used as tools to advocate for your child. And also we're going to talk about the critical role of the independent evaluator and independent evaluation. So before I start, I'm going to tell you how the workshop is going to be set up. We're going to use two actual Massachusetts court cases where the parents and school districts went to the Bureau of Special Education Appeals to settle their disputes. We're using these as case studies. And let me tell you a little bit about what that means. The Bureau of Special Education Appeals, so the BSEA, is the agency where parents and school districts will go for hearing, for a hearing officer to make a decision about the disputes. And if the parties and the parents in the school district can't come to an agreement on aspects of the child's special education supports and services, they can go to hearing. And going to hearing is kind of like going to court. This is very simplistic explanation, but it's kind of like going to court, and the hearing officer makes a legally binding decision and issues that are presented. So I am going to use the cases and other information to make the laws that we talk about tonight more concrete. But first, keep in mind that although we'll be using cases we'll be using cases only as examples to make the legal concepts concrete, but not to illustrate how using the laws parents can prevail at hearing. Just, it's important to know that the facts of each case and the individual child's needs are very unique, and outcomes can be widely different. So this is just to illustrate some of the concepts that we're going to talk about. I'm going to start by giving you some case details, and then some special education legal concepts and standards. The first case is a younger child, and then the second case is going to be for an older child. So we're going to pretty much cover the spectrum. So let's briefly talk about federal and state special ed laws. The federal law, IDEA, or the IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is the law of the land. All states are expected to develop regulations that are consistent with the federal law, but state laws cannot be weaker than the federal law. They can absolutely be stronger, though, and in Massachusetts we do have a couple of areas that are stronger than the federal law, which is great. And then the Massachusetts special ed regs are known as Chapter 766. So we do refer to both laws, and at times that can be confusing, but that's why. So we're going to start with the case study now. I'm going to talk about this guy, give you some facts, and then go into the laws. So the first case we're going to start talking about, his name is DJ. That's not his real name. His diagnosis at the time of the case was autism spectrum disorder. He also had developmental delay. His communication skills, his language skills were very, very limited. The school district had a difficult time completing all of the testing that they had to do to determine his eligibility and potential services because of his behaviors. He had a lot of self-injurious behaviors. He had a lot of unsafe behaviors outside of school. For example, there was a lot of severe head banging, screaming, and other behavior. There was a discrepancy in between his verbal and his nonverbal skills. His verbal skills were about the level of a 1.5-year-old child, and his nonverbal skills, he came in at about a 3-year-old. So this suggested that his cognitive skills were higher than his ability to communicate. He made some progress in the classroom. He was starting to imitate. His vocabulary started to increase. At one point, his words were growing up to 50 words and more, and he developed some verbal and nonverbal greeting skills. In the home and community, however, his progress was very little. In fact, there was some regression at home and in the community. His screaming and self-injurious behaviors were worse. He was still banging his head, and he was biting. He also didn't have any functional language at home. He didn't use language to ask questions or didn't use spontaneous language in any way. As far as his placement went, at first he was in an integrated half-day classroom, and he went to school 4 afternoons a week. This was a preschool. The integrated classroom meant that he was in a classroom with students that had disabilities and with students that did not have disabilities. At first, he didn't have services, but he eventually got speech therapy and occupational therapy. And after a year, his placement changed. He wasn't really making a lot of progress, and his parents did some advocacy to get his placement changed, and he went into a full-day sub-separate classroom, and this was a classroom for just children with autism. In this classroom, he received a substantial amount of applied behavioral analysis, ABA. It was intensively staffed. There was 1 teacher and 2 aides or paraprofessionals, and there were 4 children in the class, including DJ. The teacher had a lot of experience working with students with autism, and he got 6 hours of home services. So it sounds like a pretty intensive classroom, specifically geared for kids with significant needs. So in this case study, when the case went to hearing, the hearing officer ultimately had to decide these things. Is the IEP providing the student with FAPE? FAPE means a free and appropriate public education, and I'm going to explain what that means in just a few minutes. If the IEP was not providing the student with FAPE, could it be changed to provide FAPE in the least restrictive environment? And if not, did the student need an out-of-district placement? So these are the questions that the hearing officer needed to decide to make a decision. And in all cases, the school districts and the parents usually have different perspectives when they get to a hearing. And in this case, the parents' perspective was quite different from the school district's perspective, and they thought that any progress DJ made was too little. He couldn't communicate with people, and his behavior in the home and community was getting worse after all of this intensive programming, and they requested an out-of-district placement. The school district's perspective was different, and they believed that the purpose of the classroom and the programs was to develop preschool readiness skills and behavioral and language skills. That was the whole purpose of the classroom that they put DJ in. The school district's assessment was given DJ's intelligence, which they assessed to be very low. Any progress he did make was significant. The school district maintained that the IEP and placement were appropriate to meet the students' needs, and he was making progress in significant areas. For example, again, his vocabulary was increasing. They said that he was starting to use language spontaneously, and his social skills were improving. So those are some of the facts of the case. And we're going to go into some of the laws now, and then we'll talk about DJ a bit as we go along. We'll start at the beginning with eligibility. To determine eligibility, to determine if a student is eligible for special education, the IEP team has to answer 3 questions. And for eligibility, for a student to be eligible, all 3 answers must be yes. So the 3 questions: does the student have a disability? Is the student unable to progress effectively in regular education due to the disability? And does the student require special education? Now for DJ, this really wasn't a question of his eligibility. All of the answers to those questions for him were yes. But in some cases, we see that sometimes districts can get hung up on number 2, especially with higher functioning students who maybe do well academically. So maybe they're making progress academically, but not socially and emotionally. They're falling apart socially and emotionally. And sometimes we see school districts will say that they'll only focus on the academic piece of it. But it's important to know, and I will stress this throughout the workshop, that educational progress not only includes academics, but it includes social and emotional progress. So it's very clear in the law. And again, there was no problem with DJ's eligibility. Students with disabilities on an IEP have to be classified into at least one of these categories. But it's important to know that when a student is labeled, and ultimately they will be in order, because they need to be labeled for their IEP, the label does not drive the services. The student's needs drives the services. So it's not supposed to matter what the label is on the IEP. The team is supposed to consider the student's needs, and then that drives the services. A lot of times we see IEPs of students with autism classified in some of these bolded categories on the slide. Of course, autism, sometimes we see developmental delay or neurological impairment or health impairment. And again, it's not supposed to matter what the diagnostic category is or the educational category is. But sometimes we do see that if students do have they're classified as autism, they will in reality get more services, autism-specific services. And we also have the Autism IEP law, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later on, and that's important for students that do have an autism diagnosis. So a little while ago I mentioned FAPE, a free and appropriate public education. I'm going to talk about what that means. And students with disabilities have a right to FAPE. And part of what this means is that the special education the student receives must meet their unique needs. The IEP has to be tailored specifically to that student, and not just for academics, once again, including social and emotional needs. And as we know, I think everybody participating in this webinar knows that children, people with autism, have a huge variety of unique needs, and school districts must develop IEPs that meet those variety of needs. And sometimes this can be really difficult because there are so many different needs out there. But the law is really clear that the IEP has to be tailored to the student's unique needs. Another legal principle, this is about functional needs. IEPs must be developed not just to meet academic needs, but also functional needs. And functional means anything that is not academic. Again, it includes social and emotional needs. So if we look at the case, we look at DJ in terms of this legal standard, the parents' testimony, in their testimony in the case, they said that they saw less progress with language than reported in the classroom. So the language that they saw at home was really, really, really little. And it was the words that DJ was using was only through imitating or repeating. He wasn't able to use language to ask a question, to give an answer, to make a choice at home. So his language absolutely was not functional. So it's important when you look at your child's skills around, speech, physical abilities, activities of daily living, occupational therapy, look at the IEP goals and services and make sure that they're addressing the functional aspects of your child. This is where I can give you a personal experience. My son, when he was little, when he was in preschool, he also, in addition to autism, carried a diagnosis of apraxia, which is a neurological speech disorder. He had very, very little language, and whatever language he did have was pretty much unintelligible. And we were worried not only about social language, but about functional language, and we brought this up quite a few times. And one time, his preschool teacher told us that this really wasn't a problem in the classroom, his unintelligibility, because if she couldn't understand my son, or if the other adults couldn't understand my son, the children seemed to have a knack for it. They could understand him. And so they would just go grab another child in the classroom and try to figure out what Devin needed. So this was, to translate. She said that they would translate it. No, I absolutely thought that the teacher had our son's best interest in mind. She did a wonderful job in the classroom. But this was an area where we had to really fight for services because our son's functional language was not being addressed. So that's just another example to illustrate the functional aspect of the IEP. Another legal concept to understand is least restrictive environment. We talked. This was one of the questions that the hearing officer had to look at as far as DJs being educated in the least restrictive environment. What this means is that all children with disabilities must be educated with their non-disabled peers to the maximum extent that's possible and appropriate. When making placement decisions, the IEP team first needs to consider the regular classroom that the student would normally go to if they did not have a disability. Of all of the environmental possibilities, this is the least restrictive. So if the team determines that the student cannot make progress or be educated in their regular classroom that they would be in, then the question would be, could they be in that classroom if supports and services were added into the classroom? So the goal is keeping the student in the general education classroom. If not, if it still wouldn't be possible for this child to have access to the curriculum in a regular ed classroom with supports and services, then other placements would need to be looked at, like sub-separate classrooms or private special ed school, and then a very restrictive placement would be residential. So when it comes to least restricted environment, the choices are not supposed to be either a regular ed classroom with no or minimal supports, or a sub-separate classroom with supports built in. This should never be a parent's choice to make. The point is that they're supposed to try to pump in specialized services and supports into the least restrictive environment and meet the student's needs this way, and not putting a child who can be educated in the least restricted environment into a sub-separate classroom. In DJ's case, the team decided that an integrated placement was appropriate. And this is more restrictive than a general education classroom, but because of lack of progress, the team agreed that DJ needed more intensive services that could be provided in the sub-separate classroom, and his placement became more restrictive. But keep in mind that placing a student with a disability, a student with autism, in a general education classroom so that they're in the least restrictive environment does not mean that the student does not need any supports to be included in that placement. It's critical that a student with autism that needs supports and services must continue to receive them even if they're in a general education placement. The law says that IEPs must develop the student's individual educational potential. So in all disputes, usually it's, the school district will be saying that the services are sufficient and the child is making enough progress, especially in light of their potential. But many times, unfortunately, and we've seen this a lot, not more is expected. A lot of times we hear that, you know, the bar isn't raised that high because the student has autism. But we know, and I think all of you know, that a student with autism, if they're provided with intensive coordinated services as soon after diagnosis as possible, that they can make incredible progress. And the law says that students with disabilities have to have an IEP that develops their potential to learn. And for DJ, it was clear through his testing and his evaluations that his ability to express himself with language was much less developed than his verbal skills. He couldn't tell anyone, he couldn't tell you or show you what he knew. He didn't have the language skills to do that. So his IEP did not develop his educational potential. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute when we start talking about his independent experts. I can give you another example from when my son was little. He was in the 2nd grade with this example, and we noticed that he wasn't really making progress in terms of English language arts. His placement had changed from, he was originally in a self-contained classroom, and then he went into an integrated classroom and eventually into a general education classroom, and unfortunately he was with minimal supports and services. Didn't go very well in that respect. But in terms of his the academic piece with his English language arts, he wasn't doing well. So I requested special education testing to try to determine, you know, where were the gaps, because, you know, it was pretty clear that he was a very smart kid, and yet he wasn't making any progress in this area. So we had the testing done, and he actually did really well on the standardized testing. And the team, when the team reconvened, determined that the testing showed that he had the skills and the intelligence to meet the 2nd grade English language arts learning standards, and the recommendation was that he try harder. The recommendation was that he try harder, and the theory was that he wasn't putting in enough effort. So as his parents, you know, we thought about this theory of the lack of effort, and we chose rather to view this as a matter of accessing the curriculum and his potential. So it's true that all children want to do well. This is absolutely undisputed. And my son was very intelligent, and if he could do well, he would. So the potential piece here is that he had the potential to meet the learning standards, and he showed that through the testing results. He had the skills and the intelligence, but he was not able to make progress because of barriers to access. Because he learned differently. So again, the testing showed he had the skills and intelligence, but his performance showed otherwise. His grades in school and his work that he did showed otherwise. So he needed an IEP where he could develop his educational potential. And this eventually changes were made to the IEP to address the fact that he needed a different type of teaching methodology so that he could access the curriculum. I hope that made sense. Let's move on to progress. This slide is from the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, DESE or DESE. And this says that it makes it really clear that students with disabilities must be provided with special education programs and services that permit them to make meaningful educational progress. So the progress that a student makes in order to be considered effective has to be meaningful. It's not okay for it just to be trivial advancement. And in terms of DJ, while it was undisputed that he made progress, the progress was very, very little. It was actually trivial. It was very, very little. Effective progress is defined in the law, and so what this means is that effective progress means that students with disabilities must have programs and services that allow them to make documented growth, including social and emotional development, there it is again, according to these three areas. So the first one, chronological age and developmental expectations. That means what are the same age non-disabled peers doing? What are they doing? And if we look at DJ, he wasn't anywhere near his non-disabled peers when it came to language and communication and behavior and independence. DJ's vocabulary, I think it was up to 50 to 75 words, but his same age non-disabled peers had well over 4,000 and 5,000 words. So he wasn't anywhere near his same age non-disabled peers when it came to language and communication. And then we have to look at the individual educational potential. So for DJ, the bar was set way too low. There was no expectation that he could do any better than what he was doing. But his independent evaluators, which we'll be talking about in a second, they made it clear that he had potential. And also the learning standards. So learning standards are established for all students in each grade, and in order for a student to be making progress, they have to be meeting these standards. So we're going to look at some of these standards and see if DJ was meeting them. We're going to talk about the learning standards in just a second. All children are expected to learn the same content and meet the same standards. Students with disabilities must have access to the curriculum to meet the learning standards. And access can be in the way of accommodations or specialized teaching methodologies or services. And it's true that some students with disabilities won't meet the standards, but they should get programs and services so they can learn the curriculum to their potential. And many students with autism will absolutely need supports and services to access the curriculum. So here are the standards that I'm talking about. The next couple of slides are actual standards from the English curriculum framework from English Language Arts, Massachusetts. And we're using the pre-kindergartner, the preschool standards, just so we can compare them to what we know about DJ. So if we look at these, for the writing standard, it says that students will dictate words to express a preference or an opinion about a topic. For example, I would like to go to the fire station and see the truck and meet the fireman. So what we know of DJ, you can just try to imagine if he was able to meet this standard. In the second one of a language standard, the expectation was that preschoolers would be able to ask and answer questions about the meaning of new words and phrases introduced through books and activities. So DJ was not able to answer questions or ask questions because of his limited language skills. So it's really, really clear here that DJ was not meeting the standards. So when you look back at all of the areas where we need to look at to determine if effective progress was made, it's pretty clear that the answer was no, that he wasn't making effective progress. And you can look up the standards for your child's grade and get an idea of what the expectations are. And we've included, this slide here is just another example of the framework of the standards. But these are the links if you want to look up your child's grade And these are for ELA, math, and science. So you can take a look and see what the expectations are. We're going to move over to independent evaluations now. We're going to talk about independent educational evaluations, and we'll see how DJ did given the independent experts. School district evaluations can provide valuable information, and as you all know, the school district must evaluate your child with autism to determine eligibility and programs and services if found eligible. But sometimes another opinion is needed. An independent evaluation is like a second opinion, and it can be really important in securing appropriate programs and services for your child. Sometimes parents need independent evaluations when they know that their child with autism needs more or different services than what the school is providing or proposing. Or independent evals are important if the parents don't know what their child needs but disagree with what the school district is providing or proposing. Independent evaluations are also very important if you think you might be going to a hearing. If you're really having a lot of disagreement with the school district, it's also important for that. But independent evaluations are so important to resolve issues without going to a hearing. So they're just really important to have independent evaluations. And as far as DJ's experts went, he had a couple of different experts, and when they spoke to the court, to the hearing officer, they persuaded the hearing officer because of the testing and the evaluations that they did, and also they showed their experience that they had worked with hundreds of children on the spectrum, especially with profiles similar to DJ's. Because of their expertise, because of their testing, and the fact that they did observations in multiple settings in a few different times, it really increased the credibility with the hearing officer. So let's look at DJ's independent experts finding and testimony, and coupled with some legal principles that we've talked about already. So going back to the legal principle of potential, per DJ's independent evaluators, per the experts, students on the spectrum like him had the potential to do more. And DJ had the potential to make more progress than he actually did, but the problem was that the IEP goals and services lacked the necessary intensity. He also had the capacity to learn language, given his cognitive ability was higher than his ability to communicate. So look at your child's IEP goals, the present levels of performance in the IEP, and make sure, are the present levels of performance accurate? If not, then the goals are not going to be realistic. If your child can do more than what the present levels of performance say in the IEP, then the goals are not going to be challenging. Let's go back to the legal principle of FAPE, free and appropriate public education, which, remember, means developing programs and services to meet the student's unique needs. DJ's unique needs resulting from his autism were primarily around language and behavior. He was in an autism-specific classroom. He had a lot of services, a lot of intensity. He had home services. But the question is, did the school offer a program that would address his unique needs? So to answer this, the experts came in, and their view was that given the classroom observations that they made and the IEP, that no, the IEP was not meeting his unique needs. For example, language and communication were the primary IEP goals, but in their observation, they saw that the program was missing opportunities to teach language. They saw a lot of opportunities that were completely missed. And also, the IEP focused on imitation skills rather than development of language skills, and this reflected lower expectations. The IEP goals are usually drafted, are put in place for 1 year, and the expectation for DJ that it was going to take him 1 year to learn to imitate, and it certainly didn't. So again, there was a really low expectation. When it came to behaviors and the experts' observations, they saw that the behaviors, DJ's behaviors weren't in control. He was learning inappropriate, antisocial behaviors, and then he was practicing them more. He wasn't learning new, appropriate, or replacement behaviors, and he was continuing to use the inappropriate behaviors to get his needs and wants met. So again, DJ's unique needs were not being met, although his program was quite intensive. It just wasn't appropriate for DJ. This is a list of assessments. In addition to an educational assessment, the law says that a child has to be assessed in all areas related to their disability or their suspected disability. So this is a list of possible assessments to consider with autism. We're not suggesting that every student with autism needs all of these evaluations, but they are evaluations to consider. You want to make sure that your child's needs are comprehensively addressed. And also, it might be possible that your child may need 1 or 2 or 3 of these evaluations when they're younger, and maybe some different types when they're older. So this is really not an exhaustive list. It's just something for you to know that there are so many evaluations that are possible, and trying to comprehensively figure out what your child's needs are. So the school district will propose evaluations and provide you with a consent form for you to sign and return. If you think your child needs additional evaluations, then you should request them. So if a parent requests an evaluation, then the school district is obligated to do that evaluation. So if you may think that your child needs more assessments than what the school district is proposing, and you can absolutely request them. They absolutely should be done, and make sure your requests are in writing. That's really important to make sure they're always in writing. When it comes to evaluations, the bottom line is that independent evaluations must be funded. So if you disagree with the school district's testing results, you have a right to an independent evaluation at the school district's expense. And there's a couple of different ways of going about that. There are 2 options for having independent evaluations funded by the district. And option 1 is financial. If you would provide your financial information, and if you were low income, if your child was eligible for free and reduced lunch, then the school district would pay for the independent evaluation. The other option is requesting an independent evaluation to be paid for by the district without disclosing financial information. So the district has a choice when you make this request. They can either agree to pay for the independent evaluation, or they must file for a hearing and what they would want to show is that their testing was comprehensive enough to assess the student's needs, such that they would not have to fund another evaluation. So there's a couple of ways that the school district would fund the independent evaluations, but it is a little bit tricky when it comes to school districts paying for independent evaluations, because they only need to pay rate-setting rates, which are rates set by the state, and these rates are very, very, very low. A lot of hospitals will take the lower rates, and you can definitely find qualified individuals to do independent evaluations, absolutely. But sometimes it's hard to find an independent expert because a lot of independent experts will not take the low rate setting rates. But you can use your health insurance to get your evaluation funded. That's one way you can do it. Sometimes the evaluation, the health insurance will pay for all or part of your evaluation. Another point to remember is that if the school district pays for your evaluation, your independent evaluation, then that evaluation is owned by the school district and you. If you pay for the independent evaluation, whether it be out of pocket or through your insurance, it is your evaluation, and you do not need to share it with the school district. The goal, of course, is to share it with the school district. Of course, that's why you did the evaluation in the first place, but there are times you might not like what the evaluation says, or it just might not be appropriate. For whatever reason, you don't have to show that to the school district if you paid for it. It's really important to select an independent evaluator that's a good fit for your child with autism. And selecting the appropriate independent evaluator is so critical. And there's, a couple of different ways we can find good evaluators. Obviously, your local autism support center, sometimes they keep a list or lists of evaluators that parents have told them that they find are good. You can word of mouth through other parents, just talking to other parents and seeing what evaluators they have used. Major hospitals are another way to find out the evaluators that are available. Also, listservs specific to autism or disability, that's a good way to connect with other parents to find out what evaluators they have used, and you can sometimes throw out the names of evaluators that you're considering, and you'll get some feedback, or just ask, who has a recommendation for an evaluator for a specific area in your location. A couple of listservs that I've been on, there's a Yahoo group called Common Bonds, and this is a listserv. It's mainly parents in Massachusetts who have kids with autism, but it's not necessarily for Massachusetts, and it's a really great resource. I've been on this listserv for a long time, gotten a lot of good information, and they're also the AANE, the Asperger Autism Network. They have a couple of different parent groups that you can join. They have an elementary and middle school parent group, and they have a high school parent group, but you have to be a member of AANE to be part of those lists. And also there's the Concord SpedPAC website. They keep a pretty big list of evaluators. They explain different types of evaluations, and then they have a list of names that parents have said that were pretty good. When you do find your independent evaluator, when you're getting ready to select, make sure that person has experience with children with autism and the kind of programs and services that you're considering that you want for your child or you think that your child needs. You really need to ask about their experience. It's possible that an independent evaluator will have experience with autism but not your child's profile. So for example, if your child is nonverbal or has limited speech, you really want to make sure that that evaluator that you're considering has experience with nonverbal children, especially in the age of your child. So you want to interview the independent expert to find out that there's a good fit. And once you do find the independent expert, sometimes and usually the appointments can take many, many months. And that's really frustrating because we don't have many, many months when we want our kids evaluated. But one thing you could do is to get set up with an appointment. Find a couple of evaluators that you would use and make appointments. They'll be months off probably, but ask to be put on the cancellation list. And I've known so many parents who have gotten in to see independent experts because they were able to come in when there was a cancellation. And then if you are on a couple of different lists, you can cancel the appointment for the other evaluators if you get an appointment with one. When you do find your independent evaluator, especially if you think you're going to hearing, you should ask how long the final report's going to take to get. Some evaluators take a really long time, and it's important to find out in the beginning how long they say they're going to take. You also want to ask them if they observe the educational programs that your child's in or that's being considered. Some evaluators do not do that, and if you're going to hearing, that's something that's really important. And then if you are going to hearing or you think you're going to hearing, ask the evaluator if they testify, if they would testify at a hearing, because some do not. So now we're back to the decision in DJ's case. So we can answer the questions and see what happened. So the first question the hearing officer had to ask was, is the IEP providing the student with FAPE? Clearly no, and we went through a lot of the reasons why. If not, can the IEP be changed to provide FAPE in the least restrictive environment? No, they tried that a couple of times. It wasn't possible. And was it out-of-district placement warranted? And yes, this family was awarded an out-of-district placement. So the legal concepts and tools that were helpful in DJ's case were he wasn't getting FAPE. that his unique needs weren't being met. He had inappropriate IEP goals and low expectations. There was a lack of intensity of services. The IEP wasn't developed that he could learn to his potential. He made some progress, but very little in the classroom, but nowhere else. He wasn't able to generalize from the classroom to the home and the community, and any progress in the classroom he did make was not meaningful. And then the independent evaluators provided reports and observations and had experience with kids on the spectrum with DJ's profile, and this was very valuable in this case. So that's how that case turned out. Before we get to questions in the next case, there's just a couple more, I think it's just a couple more points that, just one more thing I want to cover before, because this is about assistive technology. And while this was not a factor in DJ's case, it absolutely could have been a valid consideration given his limited verbal and communicative abilities. And I'm sure there are many parents here tonight that have children that have limited speech or are nonverbal. So it's important to know that school districts must consider the need for assistive technology and augmentative and alternative communication for children with disabilities. They should do evaluations for nonverbal students or who have limited speech. And if this is an issue for your child, request an assistive technology evaluation. While school districts are supposed to consider this at the team meetings, sometimes that just doesn't happen. So request an assistive technology evaluation, and that evaluation would assess your child's current abilities, and determine what type of communication would be appropriate for your child. And if the team does determine that your child needs assistive technology, whatever system or device is recommended by the team or by the professionals, then the school district has to provide them. So this, I think, this is our place where we're going to stop for questions. And Shalene, do you want to tell me what some of the questions are?
Great. And please don't hesitate to ask us questions. We've got a lot of great ones so far. Keep them coming in. First of all, Leslie, question for you. What do you do when the school only takes part of the independent evaluation, which agrees with the results, but won't take into consideration what the doctor suggests as far as social or emotional goals? This is coming from a parent whose child gets good grades, but the school has sort of developed a blind spot when it comes to the student being behind their peers in terms of social and emotional goals.
So this question, it sounds like, and this is a really important question, is when you get an independent evaluation and the school district does not take the recommendations of the independent evaluator. That happens frequently, and not just for social and emotional areas, but in a lot of different areas. And one thing that we know is that when you're at the team meeting and you're presenting the evaluation, the independent evaluation, and if the decision is made at the team in that team meeting that the recommendations aren't going to be followed, that's just the beginning. And sometimes, I mean, the school district legally only has to consider the evaluation. They legally do not have to take those recommendations. But first of all, it's great that the school district does take some of the recommendations of the independent evaluators, which I think that's what you said in your question. But sometimes you need to do the work around the team meeting. There may be people at that team meeting that very much agree with the independent evaluators' recommendations around social and emotional. And you can, talk to the team members afterwards. Check in with them, get their opinions and their impressions. Sometimes that independent evaluation is what's needed to kind of advocate from the outside. And if you can start getting some agreement, it might not happen all at once, but you can start with the team members, see if there's any good allies that you can work with, and just keep working on it.
Great. Next question. How long does the school have to do the requested evaluation once they have a written request?
Once the school district has a written request, the school district has to provide you with once you request the evaluation, the school district has 5 days to give you a consent form. Once you return the consent form, once they have it in hand, they have 30 days to conduct the evaluation and a total of 45 days to have the team meeting to determine, to consider the evaluation.
So is the school district required to do an in-home behavioral assessment, i.e. a home FBA, now that insurance will provide home behavioral services?
No, the insurance piece and the school piece are two completely separate areas. In fact, school districts aren't supposed to consider the fact that a parent may have outside services or insurance coverage for behavioral services. So what was the first part of the question again?
Is the school district required to do an in-home behavioral assessment?
No, they're not required to do an in-home behavioral assessment, but if you request it, they must do it. They do have to do an educational evaluation and then assessments in order to comprehensively evaluate your child. So when we're talking about a child with autism, in-home assessment, behavioral assessment is absolutely one of the assessments that they should do to get a comprehensive look at the student, but it's not necessarily required. However, if you request it, then it is required and they have to do it.
So who determines if individual education potential has been achieved? This parent says her son receives C's mostly, but she believes he could do better with support. However, according to the school, he's doing really well considering how difficult the classes are.
So another piece of the law says that students with disabilities need to be provided with supports and services even if they're making progress. So if the school, but should be provided with services if they can do better. So for example, if you have a student who is doing okay, like your child, for example, maybe getting C grades and doing okay, but has the potential to do more, to do better, maybe take advanced placement classes, then the school district is obligated to provide those supports so that the student can, reach that potential. And you have the definition of progress and potential, and it's just really important to keep advocating for that, because if your child, also too, independent evaluations would be really important to, like I gave you the example of when my son wasn't doing well, and we had the evaluations done and it showed that he had the ability to do the work. That may be the case with your child. So, but definitely look at the independent evaluations and know that other piece about the law.
So if the school district has paid for an independent evaluation, can the district also fund the independent evaluator's attendance at an IEP meeting when the meeting is meant to go over the evaluation?
If the school district is paying for the independent evaluation, yeah, absolutely. To have that individual, that evaluator come to the team meeting, absolutely. In fact, it's great if they are there, depending on the evaluator, of course. I've had pretty bad evaluators at my team meetings, paid for by the school district.
And can a district also provide transportation to and from an independent evaluation appointment?
Really good question, and I don't know the answer to that one. Can a school district provide transportation to the independent evaluation that they're funding? I don't know. That's a really good question. That's one that we will write down and try to find the answer to. I'm sure I work with a lot of really smart special ed folks here. I can definitely get that answer for you pretty quickly. So I'll find that answer. Do we have that person? You want to email us and ask that question? So we'll remember. You can email Shalene at, you want to give them your?
It's sgupta@massadvocates.org. My email should be on all of these emails which have gone out in the newsletters too. Does the school district need to complete a feeding evaluation if the parent is currently in the process of having one completed?
Does the parent have, say that again, I'm sorry.
Does the school district need to complete a feeding evaluation if the parent is currently in the process of having one completed?
School districts need to do evaluations that are, that to figure out comprehensively what the needs are of the child. And a feeding evaluation is not outside of that whole area. And if a child's feeding or nutritional status is affecting their ability to access the curriculum, then that can definitely be considered. However, I don't think, I'm not sure if I understand the question, but I don't think that the school district needs to pay for the evaluation if the parent is actually having it done at the time. So you would want to request that evaluation first. But I think I see where you're going with that. No, you would need to request that first. They're not going to pay for it once you start doing it.
Can a school expect a family to go to outside services for daily living skills training?
If the school district is arranging it and funding it, I'm sure that, there's a lot of times, the teams have to come up with outside of the box solutions and ways to get a student's needs met. And if the team agrees that outside services for whatever issue would meet that student's needs and the parent agrees to it, then the school district can provide that. But they should not expect the parent to, provide that and pay for it.
And then if the school wants the independent evaluator to talk with the staff, can a parent be present for that conversation?
I don't know of any rules or regulations that say they can't. It could be a school policy, but I don't know of any rules or laws that say that you can't. But you would want to check to see what the policies are, and try to arrange it in advance and see what happens. But yeah, I don't think there's no law about it.
And then finally, before we move on, can you repeat where parents can find independent evaluators?
Sure. So different resources. Definitely check in with your local autism support center wherever you live. There should be an autism support center for your area. They should know. They should have names. You could check with major hospitals to check to see what type of departments they have that would do those types of evaluations, like Children's Hospital, or you can definitely check with other parents who have kids with autism. And then I did mention a couple of listservs or online parent groups that would be helpful that I've used, and one is Common Bonds, and it's a Yahoo group, so you just have to Google Common Bonds Yahoo, and that's a listserv for parents with kids with autism. And then there's AANE that has a couple of different groups for parents, like for parents who have children in middle school or elementary school, and parents who have older kids in high school. And that, for AANE, you have to be a member to join those groups. And then also you can find information on the Concord SpedPact website, and you would just need to Google that, and they have a pretty comprehensive list of, just have a big list of evaluators, and then they describe what different types of evaluations are and why you would need them.
We're going to be moving on now, but we will be taking more questions at the end. So if you have questions, you feel like yours didn't get answered, you want clarification, please just keep them coming in, and I'll get them to Leslie after she finishes. All right.
Okay, thanks, Jolene. So now we're going to move on to our second case study, And this, just like DJs, is a case that went to the Bureau of Special Education Appeals for a hearing officer to decide. So I'll tell you some of the details about Xavier, and then we'll start talking about some of the laws again, just like we did with DJ. So with this case is about transition. Transition services must be provided to students with disabilities ages 14 through 22. I'm going to talk a lot in detail about that in just a minute. And in this case, the parent was saying that the school district did not provide appropriate transition planning services and services for Xavier's transition to a job, to independent living, etc., and that Xavier was not at all prepared for his post-secondary goal. What Xavier wanted to do when he got out of high school, he wanted to go to college, and he also wanted to get a job working in the computer field. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Xavier and some more facts. So that's what the case was about. Some of the facts. Xavier was 19 years old. He had Asperger's syndrome, ADHD. He also had an anxiety disorder. He got A's and B's in school, so academically he did very well. He was on the track team, and he sat with the track team members at lunch. He had 2 job internships on the high school campus. He also had significant pragmatic language or social language deficits that negatively impacted his ability to understand nonverbal communication or to participate in reciprocal conversation or to socialize with others. He also had significant organizational weaknesses, and that impacted his ability to perform personal hygiene functions on a regular basis, and it also got in the way of his ability to understand some basic text. Some of the other things about him, he was taking a class at a community college. That was the only time he really left the house. Hygiene-wise, he only bathed twice a week when he was going to college, and he wasn't brushing his teeth. A couple of other things, he enjoyed playing video and computer games. He liked to research computer parts, and he liked to repair computers. He learned to get to that college course by taking the bus, but he wasn't able to learn any other bus routes. His parent tried to teach him other ways to get around by bus, but due to his organizational or his executive function weaknesses, he wasn't able to really learn any other bus routes to get around. He wanted to drive, absolutely wanted to drive, but he could not get a driver's license because he did not understand the driver's manual. It was overwhelming to him. It was difficult to use because it wasn't broken down into manageable chunks, which is what he needed. He also wanted a job, but he couldn't complete the job application. He would get started, but then he would get stuck on the military services portion of the job application. Even though he was never in the military was one of his special interests. So he really got stuck on that part and wasn't able to continue to finish the application. Xavier also had independent evaluation. He had a couple of independent eval. He had reports. Some of his experts came to the team meetings. His independent experts had observed him in high school. And some of the things they said was that he perseverated too much on his subjects of interest, and he absolutely couldn't take the perspective of others. He also didn't know what language was appropriate and inappropriate in different contexts. So he would speak about unrelated topics in class appropriate for maybe a one-on-one conversation, but not in a whole class. So those are some things about Xavier. Now, as far as the school district perspective, the school district felt that Xavier made significant educational progress during his 4 years of high school. He met the graduation standards, and he was doing well academically. They also felt that he did well in his 2 vocational internships. They saw him as being more relaxed and organized, and his organizational skills they felt were improving. And the teachers and staff viewed Xavier as ready for his post-secondary goal, again, to go to college and work in computers. And they assumed that he could fill out a job application because he could explain accurately how to do it. But in reality, he couldn't do it because of his perseverations around the military piece of it. So this is an issue of him not being able to generalize. However, from the school perspective, because he could tell you how to do it, the assumption was that he could do it, and in reality that wasn't true. Of huge importance in this case is that while Xavier had significant pragmatic language deficits, he had independent evaluations, there were observations, recommendations were made, but the school district did not take the independent evaluators' recommendations because from their perspective, he was doing fine based on their observations of him in school. They saw him sitting with the track team. They saw him in his internships in school, and they just assumed, based on their observations, they thought he was doing fine. They assumed that his skills would transfer outside of the school setting. So for Xavier, one of the issues that the hearing officer had to decide in this case was, were appropriate transition planning and services provided? And as we did for DJ's case, we're going to look at the laws, mainly transition laws with Xavier. We'll also talk about some of the other laws that we've already covered and, as a way to make the laws concrete. Xavier's parents maintained that he wasn't prepared at all for what came after high school. And this is important because the whole purpose of special education is to prepare students with disabilities for further education, employment, and independent living. Remember earlier what we said about the need to develop IEPs that address the student's functional skills? Well, that was an issue with this case as well. From Xavier's parents' perspective, his functional needs were not considered when his IEPs were developed. And this is important for parents. From preschool to high school, it's important to keep this in mind. It's not just if you have older children. While the goal of special ed is for what happens when they leave school, it's not something that parents should put off thinking about if you have younger kids. It takes a long time to prepare our kids for what happens after high school, especially when it comes to the functional needs. So if your child has issues with behavior or language deficits or social skills, if they're present when they're young, it's very possible that they won't go away, very probable that they won't go away without some sort of intervention. And all of these things can affect employability, independent living, education, and more. So always keep in mind the purpose of special education. That's one thing you should always keep in mind. We're going to talk about transition. When students with disabilities in Massachusetts turn 14, they're entitled to transition services. The federal law says 16, so in Massachusetts, this is an area where our law is a little bit stronger. So in Massachusetts, students turn 14, they're entitled to transition services. And transition services, it's planning services, it's a multi-year process that helps students move from high school to post-school activities. Now, there is another transition law, and this is called the Turning 22 law, or the 688 Adult Services Process. These are two distinctly different laws. Special ed transition while you're in school, a student with a disability, age 14 to 22, this is an entitlement. Transition services are an entitlement where transition planning to adult services, or the 688 process, is a planning process that school districts, adult agencies, and parents go through to plan what adult services the students will need when they're out of high school. And a lot of those services, the adult services, they have eligibility requirements, they're based on funding, and they're not guaranteed. So they're two completely different laws, but they do have a lot of the same players, so sometimes it's confusing. So with special ed law, the law says specifically that schools must provide services that take into account the student's strengths, preferences, and interests. And previously, not too many years ago, there wasn't much choice for students with disabilities, and this was pretty sad because that was based on assumptions of lack of presumed competence. Now, strengths, preferences, and interests of the student must be taken into account all through the process. And this is important because not all youth with intellectual disabilities or autism want to be custodians or baggers in a grocery store, or not all youth with Asperger's want to work with computers. Getting a student prepared for what they're going to do after high school really needs to be something that they're interested in. I don't know anybody out there, anybody who'd want to train or get prepared for a job after high school that they don't like. So this is the same for students with disabilities. As far as Xavier's case, if we think about it, Xavier had strong academic skills and he wanted to go to college and get a job. And for some students, that's enough. For some high school students, they get good grades, they want to go to college, then that's enough. They can get to college, if they have the other means to do so. But for Xavier, it wasn't enough. The goals and services he needed to do in order to meet his post-secondary goal were he needed language and social skills, pragmatic language and social skills instruction to be successful. In order to develop transition goals and services, school districts must do age-appropriate transition assessments, and they must be done for the student's IEP when they're 14. The transition assessments are required to determine what the student's current skills are and the disability-related needs, and then the recommendations for programs and services in order for the student to make progress. For Xavier, the school district eventually did a transition assessment. However, it was inadequate and it was untimely. They didn't do the services for him when he was, do the assessments rather, when he was 14. In fact, it wasn't until his junior or senior year that they did the assessment, and they didn't do complete assessments. I think they only did it in 1 or 2 areas. It's really important to start early because, like I said earlier, it can take a long time to meet the goals, to gain the skills to meet the goals that are needed for after high school. Parents should request transition assessments. Now, the law says that the assessments have to be done when the student's 14 or starting when the student is 14. And from our experience, not all school districts will say, okay, your student's 14 now, let's do a transition assessment. Sometimes that doesn't happen. And so I would say for every parent, when your child turns 14, or even if your child is over 14 now and it hasn't been done, request a transition assessment based on training, education, employment, and independent living. And do this in writing. It's really important to do it in writing. There is a letter, a sample letter on our website, a sample letter requesting transition assessments. It has a lot of really good language. In fact, I used it myself when I requested transition assessments for my son. So it's on our website, and if you can use that, use the exact language, use what resonates with you, but it's important to do that in writing. So remember earlier when we talked about FAPE, how this means in part providing programs and services to students with disabilities that make their unique needs. This was the same for transition services. Transition services are based on a student's unique needs. So what was appropriate for Xavier is not necessarily appropriate for another student. For example, Xavier wanted to go to college and work with computers, but maybe a goal for another student would be to live in a group home and get a job with a job coach. All transition goals and services are dependent on the individual student. So the IEP must include 2 types of transition goals related to training, education, employment, and independent living if that's appropriate. The first type of transition goal is a measurable post-secondary IEP transition goal, again based on age-appropriate transition assessment. And this means, what does a student want to do when they finish high school? When a student is 14 years old, there should be their post-secondary goal, and this is not going to look the same as when they're 18 years old. This is a fluid process, and it's going to change, but it definitely needs to be included in the IEP, and it goes into the vision statement section of the IEP. The other type of transition goals are the IEP and the annual IEP transition goals. And these transition goals address the disability-related needs in order for the student to achieve the post-secondary goal. These goals can be embedded in other goals, or they can be separate goals. There also is, one other thing I forgot to mention is that when the school district is working on transition planning, they're going to use a transition planning form. It's called the TPF sometimes. And this is a really good planning tool that school districts must use. It's mandated that they use these forms. And it helps the team figure out, based on the student's post-secondary transition goal, what they want to do when they get out of high school. It helps them figure out what steps, what services, what resources are needed for that student to meet that goal. It outlines the disability-related goals and what the action steps need to be in order to meet those goals. So that's a great planning tool, and it's on a separate sheet, it's on a separate form, but it's important to know that that form is not part of the IEP. That is just a planning tool. Some districts will staple it to the IEP, and that is not the same as being part of the IEP. The team, once they fill out that form, has to take the information that's in that form and weave it into the IEP in the appropriate places. So that form has to be reflected in the IEP in all the different areas that would be appropriate. So keep that in mind. A transition planning form, mandated, great planning tool, but it is not part. It is not a legal part of the legal document. So for Xavier, the school district didn't do he didn't have any of these goals in his IEP. He had no measurable post-secondary goal to address vocational or further education or independent living, nor did he have goals related to his greatest area of need, which were his pragmatic language deficits. So all in all, failure to provide proper assessments leads to the inability to develop appropriate goals and appropriate transition goals. So the things listed here are our transition supports and services. And I'm going to give you some examples. I'm going to talk about these using examples from Xavier's case. So transition services can come in the form of instruction. And to think about some of Xavier's needs, he didn't get any of this, but it would have been helpful if he was given specific instructions filling out job applications. He needed instruction. He needed practice. He could have been instructed on around job applications a section at a time, and maybe with the goal of not perseverating or figuring out how not to perseverate on the military section, how to overcome that piece. He would have benefited from pragmatic language instruction in a small group. In a small group, they could take turns interviewing and being the interviewer, getting some practice. There could be social stories developed for him, also instruction around organizational skills, and also instruction around activities of daily living like dressing and hygiene. For related services, a speech therapist could provide services to help him understand body language or idioms or other social language. Occupational therapists could help provide services to work on organizational skills, executive function skills. And also with community experiences, the law is really clear. There has to be community experiences with transition services. This means going out into the community, actually practicing or using some of the skills learned with the instruction that they've received. So for example, going out into the community, learning how to dress for an interview. As far as the pragmatic language goes, Xavier could have been taught about the need to act and talk and dress differently in each of the areas of work and home and community, and then practice. And also with community experiences, one of the issues in his case was that the school district said that he did get community experiences by way of the internships that were provided for him. And the experts in his case said that the internships provided were not sufficient. He could not use the skills that he learned in that particular job internship out in the real world. He needed community experiences so that he could generalize what he had learned about what he should have learned about social culture and actual work. Xavier had no placement experiences in the community, and special ed law refers specifically that there has to be community experiences. And some of the daily living skills like bathing and dressing, these were challenges for Xavier because of his organizational skills, so he could have been taught some of these things. The hearing officer made, in the decision, one of the issues what we said was that were appropriate transition planning services provided, and no, that the hearing officer determined that no, they were not determined. In the end, Xavier received extensive compensatory services that addressed pragmatic language, vocational skills, and independent living. So that legal principles that helped Xavier in this case, just as with DJ's case, was free and appropriate FAPE, unique needs. His unique needs were not met. He wasn't making progress, and given his potential to learn, these were all legal tools in his case. The independent evaluators made it clear they had the potential to learn organizational skills, pragmatics, social skills, if he received the necessary transition instruction and services at the appropriate time. And again, I just want to make sure that these principles are not just for hearing, even though that's how we presented the law in these cases. They are a strong foothold for parents when they need to make arguments or to have evidence in a team process. And knowing the purpose of special education is another way to frame discussions around your child's needs. So that wrapped up our second case study, but there are a couple of more laws that I want to talk to you about before we get to our questions. The next law I want to talk to you about is the Autism IEP Act. And this law you may be familiar with. It was passed in 2006, and a very comprehensive advisory came out in 2007. The special ed technical advisories are advisories that the State Department of Elementary and Secondary Education Special Ed Department puts out so that administrators, special educators, give them guidance on how to respond or comply with this law. And this guidance that was put out, this technical advisory that was put out, is online. It's multi-page. It's very it's got a lot of really good detail in it. So anyway, what the law says, let me tell you what the law says. The Autism IEP Act says that IEP teams must consider and address these areas that are listed here. So the IEPs of students with autism should not be silent in any of these applicable areas. So again, this technical advisory, it provides guidance, and it's something that I recommend every parent access and get a hold of, because it is so helpful. I won't go over these things in a lot of detail, but if you just look at the list, the advisory talks about things like communication skills. Does your child have needs around verbal and nonverbal communication? The team needs to consider that, and they should be asking these questions at the meeting. What kinds of communication systems would be appropriate for a student who's nonverbal? DJ was functionally nonverbal, and the team should have looked at this to implement services with his communication. They could have looked at this. Xavier, again, and for communication skills, he was an older student, but he definitely, as we described, had some real problems around social language. Social skills, what types of social overtures is the child capable of making? These are the types of questions that should be asked about all of these different areas. Sensory, what does the student have unusual sensory experiences? And so for each of these areas, there's a lot of advice given. And again, we like to tell parents to take a look at the advisory, look at this list, and it's a good way to prepare for your team meetings, to go over what areas your child has needs in. Not every student with autism is going to have all of these needs, but usually students with autism have at least one of these needs. So it's important to to be familiar with. The next law, and I think this is the last one, yep. The next law is the Autism Omnibus Law, and this is a law that was recently passed. And it came about because the Autism Commission was established in 2010 by the Governor Patrick at the time, and this was to evaluate programs and services for people, adults and children, with autism in Massachusetts to identify the gaps in services. And based on the findings, the Autism Commission did this research, and their finding, the report was put out in 2013, and based on those findings, the Autism Law was enacted. And this is one law that has 6 laws in one. So I'll tell you about the 6 parts. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. We do have a separate training on the Autism Omnibus Law, and I believe Joanne Pino from MAC just did a webinar on the Omnibus Law, but we can always come and do, if anybody wants to find out more, we definitely can do trainings for folks. But so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I will tell you about it. So one of the first areas of this law is that Mass Health is now required to cover medically necessary treatments for Mass Health eligible children with autism who are under 21 years old, and this includes ABA therapies and also dedicated and non-dedicated AAC devices like iPads and laptops. And previously, health insurance did not cover things like iPads, so that's something that they need to cover, as well as ABA. There's also an autism endorsement for special ed teachers, and this is where special ed teachers can take courses to get in-depth knowledge about educating students with autism. When special ed teachers get their teaching license, they're not required to know the in-depth knowledge that would be needed to really educate a child with autism. And now this has an avenue for that. So teachers that are going through their teaching program can get this specialty credential, or special ed teachers that are already special ed teachers can also take the courses and do the practicum work to get this specialty credential. And this is great because it is voluntary, and it's great because school districts are having, it's getting difficult. It's difficult to educate all the students with autism. So having teachers that are in the districts with this credential is going to be a real plus. There is a change in eligibility criteria for the Department of Developmental Services, or DDS. Previously, eligibility for DDS services was based on IQ criteria, and now it's based on functional criteria. So before the law, and this omnibus law, in order to be eligible for DDS services, things like training, support groups, respite, the individual had to have an IQ lower than 70. They had to also have an intellectual disability. And a lot of people, as you know, with autism don't have IQs lower than 70, but they can live independently. I think a lot of us know people that have, with autism, that have very high IQs, but don't have the functional skills. They can't cross the street, or can't safely, or can't take care of their personal hygiene independently. So now the law says that eligibility for people is based on functional skills, which is great. There's also the creation of tax-free savings accounts. They're called ABLE accounts, and these are accounts that help families cover anticipated disability-related expenses for people with autism and other physical and developmental disabilities. These are expected to be available in 2017, and we recommend that anybody who wants to know more about this or wants to consider this is to consult a financial consultant, somebody who has special knowledge in this area, because it is an option. It may or may not be an option that's a good fit for you, so you'd want to find out as much as you can. Another piece of the Omnibus Law is that the Department of Mental Health, DMH, and DDS have to develop and implement a plan to provide services to individuals who have both mental illness and developmental disabilities. Prior to this, it was very difficult for, if you had an autism diagnosis, and this is for adults, an autism diagnosis to get services from DMH because they would send you back to DDS and vice versa. So now if an individual has a severe mental illness, they should be able to get services by both departments. And the plan has actually come out already, and we'll be taking a look at that to see what the details are of that. And then the last part of the omnibus bill is the Autism Commission has now been established as a permanent entity. When it was established in 2010 by Governor Patrick, it was a time limited, just to figure out what the gaps were in services for people with autism. But now this is a permanent entity, which is wonderful. And the goals, now they will be overseeing, making sure that these laws are carried out, all of these laws that we just mentioned. And there's an executive director and 34 members of the Autism Commission, members from autism support centers, legislature, parents, advocacy groups. MAC is part of the Autism Commission. So this is wonderful, great that this is a permanent commission. So we're just about done with the laws. A couple of more points. I just want to talk about extended school year services or summer programs. Parents are usually very concerned about summer programs, especially around this time of year. And some of the things that the law says about extended school year services, or ESY, it's just like the rest of the IEP. It has to be based on the child's unique needs. So services can't be limited or unilaterally limited because of policy. Whatever the services are have to be based on the unique needs. And there can't be just summer programs only for specific disabilities. And also in terms of eligibility in Massachusetts, we use the regression standard for extended year services. And a lot of times school districts are documenting regression, and that's great. You want to have a documented of regression, but it's important. I like to recommend that parents document behavior or any other skill likely to regress even after long weekends, vacations, extended sick days. Keep your own log, and also check in with teachers after those extended leaves away from school. Talk to them about maybe some of the areas where you might suspect regression, and ask them what they think. And of course, take notes and write that down. And also, if your child does activities outside of school, it's important if they do regress because they're not getting the services that they normally are getting in school because of extended leave or vacation, you could get some input from maybe a sports coach or the person who's providing the activity. And then with extended day services are also based on FAPE. They're based on the unique needs of your child. However, they do not look at any regression standards. It's based on the unique needs of your child. And then just to kind of wrap it up, these are some procedural safeguards that are there for parents. There's mediation. There's the Bureau of Special Education Appeals, the BSEA, if you think you're heading toward a hearing. There's also program quality assurance from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, known as PQA, and they will receive complaints about procedural violations. And these are procedural violations and not disputes about quality issues or matters of opinion about teaching methodology, for example. And then there's the Office of Civil Rights, the OCR, and they enforce laws that prohibit discrimination based on disability. The cases that we talked about in this workshop, the first one, DJ, this is his BSEA case, and the second one, Xavier, was from the Dracut Public Schools. And if you want to read these cases, you can just Google BSEA numbers and the school district name, and it will come up easily, and you can read all about those cases. So we're gonna take time for questions, But I just wanted to remind people that might not be sticking around for the questions, who might want to log off now, that there is a survey that will come up when you log off, and it's really important for us to take the survey. As Shalene said, we take it very seriously. We want to know what your inputs are, what your input is. And so for those of you that are leaving, thank you for attending, and right now we can take some questions.
Great. Thanks, Leslie. And for everyone else, got some great questions here. If you want to ask anything, type it in. I'll pass it along. First up, if a student, this has to do with transition, with graduating, actually. If a student has met credits and MCAS requirements, whose decision is it if the student accepts a diploma or not? In this particular case, the parents feel like the transition goals have not been met, but the school wants the student to graduate as soon as possible. The mediator in this case has mentioned that the district decides if the student will accept the diploma or not, and the parents have no say.
So that's a really good question, and that's one that we actually hear a lot. So if a student with a disability has if you don't feel that that student is ready to graduate because they haven't met their transition goals, they're not ready for life after high school, keep in mind that graduation is a placement, and you as a parent can reject that placement, just like you can reject any other placement when you were going through the IEP process with your child. So you can reject the graduation as a placement, and you have stay put. But you would have to really work on what would be happening in school with stay put. So the school district cannot force your child to graduate if you reject the placement.
So question on transition. Here's a parent who worries that their child won't get transition services if the school takes him off of his IEP and puts him on a 504 plan. How can we keep our son on an IEP?
Well, that's something to definitely worry about. So you can do stay put again, depending on your circumstances and the details around your situation. So if a school district wants to take your child off of an IEP, first they have to do evaluations and testing before they can make that decision. They can't just take them off of it. But you can do stay put to keep them on the IEP, but then you would have to work through the issues, the reasons why the school district wants to take them off. And a lot of that, it would be helpful if you had independent evaluations that would support your position that your child still needs to be on an IEP. Because yes, they would not get transition services if not on an IEP.
Another question about a 504. This parent's son has been on an IEP since kindergarten, but now at 16 they're proposing a 504. The parent has read and seen that there are related services that can be put on a 504 plan. Is that true? Can you provide examples?
Yes, it is true. There can definitely be related services in a 504. A 504 plan can be quite good, and they can have some services, definitely. The one thing that a 504 doesn't have is the protections that an IEP has. The IEP has a lot more structure in being on an IEP is you have the protections of the federal law that talks about time frames and guidelines, and that's not present on a 504, but you definitely can get related services on a 504.
And then another question. We had a school-based transition assessment that seemed more like an interest inventory. Should that have measured skills and aptitude?
Yeah, so remember what we talked about earlier, that an interest inventory, that definitely can be part of a transition assessment, but you want a comprehensive assessment. You want one that evaluates the areas that we talked about, education, employment, independent living, And that's not just one assessment. There is no one assessment that's really going to cover all of those things. So school districts would have to do a variety of, sometimes they do a variety of assessments. An interest inventory is not enough. So if you go to our website and you look at the sample letter to request transition assessments, it has all of that language in it that is very specific. The request is very specific. So you can go back and make that request and tell them that you want a very comprehensive transition assessment.
Real quickly, can you recap what the school's transition form is called?
So the school district's transition form is called a transition planning form. You can Google that. It'll come up, and it's a lot of times it's just called the TPF.
And then someone just wanted a brief recap of what is the other law besides the 688 for transition?
So the 688 transition law is the one where students with disabilities, they meet with their school, with the school department, with adult service agencies, and any other agency, so that they can plan what adult services the student with a disability is going to receive when they get out of high school. So this does not prepare a student for getting out of high school. It does not prepare a student to gain the skills that they need for future employment, independent living, education, and those things. It's just to make arrangements and plan for what's going to happen, for what adult services they would need. Some students with disabilities don't need any adult services. Now, the law where it's an entitlement, that's just part of special ed law. Special ed law mandates that when students turn 14, the school districts have to conduct transition assessments in order to put in place transition services and planning.
And then, in addition, is there a time limit after graduation to attempt to prove that the district did not provide FAPE due to failure in college?
I don't know the answer to that question, but it's an excellent question. That's a question I will have to look, find out more information. And again, if you would email that question to Shalene, she'll pass it on to me, and we'll definitely get you the answer to that.
Transitioning over to questions about evaluations. If a school recommends, one second, let me repeat that. If the school recommends several different types of tests once the parent has requested an independent evaluation and cognitive testing is on that list, can a parent advocate that a neuropsych be paid by the district as part of the evaluation test bundle?
So I think what that question is that if the school district is recommending a series of tests that look at academic, cognitive function, can the parent request a neuropsych eval? You can definitely request a neuropsych eval. You can do that regardless of what the district is proposing. However, if you do that, you would want to have some coordination between the district testing and what the independent neuropsych testing, what tests they use, because you don't want to duplicate. You don't want to do the same type of testing. So you'd have to kind of coordinate what exact tests would be used in that. So you can, if you request a neuropsych, even though those tests are done, they should do that. I'm pretty sure they should do that. It sounds like what you're saying is that some of the testing that the school is going to do could be part of a neuropsych test, but it doesn't sound like it's comprehensive.
Can a district require an independent evaluator to administer particular tests instead of leaving it up to the evaluator?
Oh, good question. I don't think so. I don't think so. That doesn't sound right to me. But that's another one I'm probably going to have to check on. I think that what happens is if your school district does their evaluation, let's say a speech evaluation, just for example, and you disagree with the findings, you can request an independent evaluation to do another speech evaluation. I don't think they have to copy the exact type of testing that the district does. For example, they could add pragmatic language, but I'm not 100% sure. So that's one that I know in terms of they have to do an independent evaluation for the type of evaluation that you disagree with. But as far as the, the real nitty-gritty details, I'm not sure about that one. That's like the third time I said I'm not sure.
You're doing great.
Okay.
How does DDS determine functionality?
Oh, good question. They do have guidelines, and I believe they're on their website, but we do have them here. I know I can send those to you. There's a few different ways that they determine it, and there's a lot of forms and forms that have to be filled out. But there is a very specific way that they determine that.
And a question, if somebody brought DDS to a few IEP meetings, but then their school district denied access to view off-site post-grad programs, saying that the parents were working with DDS. What are your thoughts on this, and how can the parent get referrals to see other programs?
Can you say that again?
Yeah, so the parent is saying that they brought DDS along to a few IEP meetings, but then the district denied the parents access to view other post-grad programs because the parent was working with DDS. What are your thoughts on this?
I do not understand why a school district would deny access to view other post-grad options. That doesn't make any sense to me. That makes absolutely no sense. They should be able to look at a variety, a realm of different options to determine what's going to happen in adulthood.
It sounds like we'll need a few more details on this. So our advice to you would be to call our helpline, which is at 617-357-8431, and one of our staff members will get back to you. Question about technology. So if an ASD classroom switches to using an ACE curriculum specifically for autism for all students instead of tying their instruction to Common Core or state standards, would that impact FAPE factors?
I'm going to have to hear that again.
Sure. So if an autism spectrum classroom switches to using an ACE curriculum for all students instead of instructing based on Common Core or state standards, does that impact FAPE factors?
I am not familiar enough with ACE curriculum. I'm not really sure what that means. So if you would like to talk about it some more, that's another, you could give our helpline a call and find out some more, because I'm not familiar with that at all.
More on tech. So who could I contact to inquire about assistive iPads or laptops?
So the steps about iPads and laptops, there's a few different steps that you would have to take. For Mass Health, I'm assuming this is for Mass Health because that's what we were talking about. You would have to get your doctor would have to make a referral for a speech, for an assistive technology evaluation, and assuming it's a speech therapist that would do the evaluation, and the speech therapist would have to make a diagnosis of a severe communication disorder and make recommendations for assistive technology. Usually, the student would have to try a couple of different types of assistive technology, but in the end, the speech therapist would be able to make the specific recommendations for the iPad or the laptop, and then those items, or whichever item, would be procured at a durable medical equipment provider, which the speech therapist should know familiar with.
Fantastic. And then again, classic question, but in a nutshell, if you think your child has not met the goals of an IEP, but the school says they have, quick tips. What should the parent do?
Well, if the parent says that the student has not met the goals and the school district says that they have, I'm assuming that the school district wants to move on with making new goals, because usually when you meet IEP goals, you go to the next step and develop the next goals. So you can reject that. You can reject if in a proposed IEP, and I'm assuming this person is still on an IEP. You can reject the new goals, and once you reject it, once again you have stay put. So the last agreed upon signed IEP that was in place, it remains until you work out your differences. So you don't have to accept that.
Question about assistive technology evaluations. Our assistive technology evaluation indicated that keyboarding was allowed for somebody who has autism, is high functioning, but has executive function concerns. Should we be expecting more for that? Can we expect more?
So assistive technology evaluation determined that keyboarding would be allowed to use in school. If this is a school district assistive technology evaluation, and the findings are that the student would need this type of technology, then I'm not, as far as more goes, I think maybe you're asking if there should be services provided to teach keyboarding, or if the keyboard should be, or if the computer should be provided to the student. It depends on how, it all depends on team agreement. So if the team agrees specifically that the student needs to keyboard, then they should be provided the services to keyboard, to learn to type.
And just a general announcement, because I've been getting quite a few questions about this. If you want access to the presentation, go to the handouts tab, which should be under the questions tab. Click the plus sign and you'll get a link to download it. And we'll be posting a recording of this webinar on Tuesday. And then one last question. Could you just offer your thoughts on the social skills curriculums that schools tend to offer? This parent has a child who's in an integrated preschool and has social skills deficits, but feels like the school is expecting the child to pick this up through osmosis because it's an integrated school.
Yeah, so if you're questioning the appropriateness of the social skills curriculum for your child, you can definitely, well, first of all, look at their social skills goals in the IEP. Are they meeting their goals? Are they making progress? So if they're not, which it sounds like they're not, then it would appear that something different would be needed, and you could argue for that based on the fact that the student's not making progress for social skills. And sometimes the social skills program, there are some that are good for students with autism. I'm not sure what program this student has, but you could also make the argument that something needs to be very specific for a student with autism, because they won't pick it up, normally don't pick it up through osmosis.
And then our last question for the night. If a child has been diagnosed with autism, emotional-based, along with additional diagnoses, and they are on a 504, are they eligible for an IEP?
So there has to be a good question. There has to be a determination made by the team, and if you go back to eligibility from the beginning, even if there is an autism diagnosis, that doesn't automatically mean that a student would be eligible for special education in an IEP. So again, the questions for eligibility is, does the student have a disability? Are they unable to make progress in the general curriculum? And if not, do they need specialized instruction? So you could have a student who is on the autism spectrum who maybe does not meet the criteria of those questions according to the team. So, but you would definitely, look, I can't say enough about getting independent evaluations. But yeah, so just because you have a diagnosis does not necessarily mean that you are eligible for special ed services. Now, I know that could be frustrating, especially if you disagree with that.
So that's all the questions for tonight. I just want to reiterate that in terms of getting these handouts, if you go back down to the menu, so there's a place where you can ask questions. There should also be a tab that says handouts. If you click the plus button and click the link, you should be able to download the handouts. If you're still not able to do it, feel free to email me and I'll send you the handouts as an attachment.
Great, thanks, Charlene, and thanks everybody for attending our webinar. Remember, there's going to be a survey that's going to come up. It's going to appear in your window, and again, this is really important. And if you'd like to be added to our mailing list, you can sign up at our website at www.massadvocates.org or email Charlene. Thanks for being a great audience, and have a wonderful night.